talking with my peers at the Divinity School who were very involved in events in Roxbury, I knew perfectly well that the Black community in Boston was in turmoil. And that's part of what led to the story that you've read about how Selma came to Squam. So maybe that's enough of an introduction. Uh, one thing that Ann and I were talking about at supper was her involvement in the fair housing issue. Uh, Unfortunately, neither of us can remember just when one particular incident happened. Ann, I don't know, do you want to talk about your visit to the courthouse?
Well, we had gotten a call from some group, Carol Gabin. The Gabin family lived in Rockport, and George Gabin was a well-known artist. Some of you probably have a piece of his work in your home. And the Gabin, Carol and her family had the Kramer's pottery shop out on Bearskin Neck. And Carol and I were called and said, would you be at the courthouse up in Newburyport by 8:30 tomorrow morning and witness for a man who is trying to buy a home in that area. And he was a Black man, and there were no other Black men. And they wanted to have somebody who could come and stand up for him as a neighbor and say he would be a good member of the community. So Carol and I, both of us had young children, and in that short time, we didn't always get babysitters arranged. So we drove up to, we each took a couple of our kids. We thought maybe that would make the judge take pity on this man. And we drove up to Newburyport. And when we got to the courthouse, we found that the judge was not going to take pity in us. And he said, no children are allowed in my court. So Carol and I had to take turns, one of us sitting in court and make a testimony if called upon, and the other one would sit out in the hall and supervise several young children who were having a lot of fun. I think the man's lost his case. He was not allowed to settle in Newburyport, and I don't think Newburyport since then has gotten a great number of Black people who moved there. But that was the first experience for Carol Gabin and myself in trying to understand what happens to people if they have the money, they want to buy a home, and they want to live in these lovely places beside the ocean, and they are not allowed. So that was what Carol and I experienced.
To bring us up to date, others may chime in along the way. I sent Sue some statistics which maybe didn't come out to other people, but out of curiosity yesterday, I Googled to see what's happening in Boston in relation to racial discrimination, and in particular in the schools, because that was the hottest issue in 1963, and discovered that the Boston schools have had a program for talented students that has now been temporarily discontinued because of the percentages in that program. That is, the African American percentage is far lower than it is in the school population as a whole. So the issues of discrimination in the schools, which are so tied in with housing and with employment, seem to remain in Boston. I also Googled Selma to look at their city council and their school board, and came up with an article about the inauguration of their new mayor back in the fall of 2020, after the November election. Very handsome black man. Selma was just recovering from the hurricane that had come through, and he was talking about how good it is that the community was able to pull together in response to that hurricane. And I Googled the school website and saw pictures of both white and black teachers in the school system, but predominantly black, and realized that the efforts on voter registration that were going on from 1960 through 1965 and beyond in Selma have resulted in, obviously, the success of the Black residents of Selma in getting elected to many of those public offices. Then I Googled the census data on Gloucester to see what the racial makeup is of Gloucester today. And it's, what was it, 1%?
Less than.
Less than 1%. Not much changed from the 1960s. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of factors involved, but one factor, and Gwen Haddon in her email pointed this out, is that there is a reverse migration now back to the South by Black families who find that the South is much more congenial than it used to be. So maybe that's enough to lead to some more discussion.
Or do they want to know how the students got to come here? Did that story get told?
So John, I'm sensing your intention is, since we all had a chance to read what you offered, that you would like to take questions that anyone would have based on what they read. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So folks, if you have a question for John or Ann, you can raise your hand or use the hand raising option within Zoom, and I will call on you and you can ask your question to John. Jay, please unmute.
Hi, this is the question for Ann. I am very curious to know what the subject of the case, the legal case was. What was the issue when you went to Newburyport?
When the question was, this man wanted to buy a house, and the landlord, the owner, wasn't selling it to him. It wasn't, and so he was, and with a lawyer, was objecting to fair housing. He should be allowed to purchase a home, and that was
the issue.
wasn't allowed. And so we were representing a neighborhood, although we didn't know the man or the neighborhood, but we were white and we were good-hearted and thought he would be a good neighbor.
We can't recall what the law was at that time. There was a Massachusetts Commission on Discrimination, and the Cape Ann Council on Civil Rights appointed a liaison to that commission, but we can't remember what the legalities were then. That is, on what basis he might be able to go to court on the purchase of a house.
When we had moved in, we'd moved into Arlington in the suburb of Boston. And at that time, a number of people wanted to move out of Roxbury. Black people wanted to move to the suburbs, and they weren't able to. They were not able to find any realtors who would show them houses in the suburbs or owners who would sell to them. So there was a committee of white people like us, and we would be the go-betweens, and we would look at all the houses that were up for sale, and then we would meet with the Black family and see what kind of a house they were looking for. And when we made a match, then we would be the front man and see if we could make the case for them to be able to buy the house. And we had the law on our side, but it was hard. I remember a family at that time was a mixed race family. She was white and he was Black, and they wanted to rent. And I had located a good rental, checked it all out. It was the kind of a place they were looking for. It was on Massachusetts Avenue. They could go to work. And the owner said, yes, he would be happy to rent it. I didn't tell him anything about the people, especially. And then the Saturday they moved in, and when the owner saw that it was a mixed race couple, he said, you can't come here. I won't, you can't have this. And he was trying to put them back on the truck. And our committee was a little upset. And luckily we had a friend who was the mayor of Arlington at that time. And the mayor of Arlington went to the police chief, and they appeared on the scene. And then the owner relented and let them move into the apartment. But with that kind of a welcome, they didn't stay more than a year. But that was the kind of thing that would happen at that time.
Thank you. And Gwen has a question, and then Rob.
No, I wanted to respond about the fair housing laws. They weren't instituted federally until 1968. And so people had no grounds. Massachusetts had some, but they were not really enforced. And so you had no redress on a federal level until 1968. And then it took years for that to be effective.
Thanks, Gwen.
Also had no bank willing to lend the buyer money.
But then for a Black family who had worked and grew up in Roxbury and saved their money, often they had money and they had access to ability to put up the money, but then they couldn't come into the community because of the community's restrictions.
And there weren't fair lending laws until around the same time either. So there was the issue of not having the law that said you could buy a house, and not having the law that said a bank was forced to finance your house.
Yeah.
And of course, it was after we moved to Arlington in 1965 that the Metco program began, and our kids were on this Zoom session, would have stories to tell about the Metco children who were bused to the Arlington schools. But that's another chapter in the long diversity story.
Rob.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I had lived in Arlington before coming out here full time. And Arlington was probably in part because of your efforts and your group's efforts, that was one of the very few suburbs that the NAACP would advise Black people that they would be comfortable in. It was Arlington, Cambridge, and Brookline. And that were the only communities that were thought to be somewhat welcoming to Black people.
What years was that, Rob?
This
Somewhat.
would be in the in the 60s.
Because we tried to buy a house in Arlington in 68
Yeah,
and could not buy one.
it was
could not.
taking off in the late 60s, and then in
Yeah.
the 70s it became
Mhm.
consolidated.
It depended on what part of Arlington. If you were in South Arlington, close to Cambridge, but then the farther you got closer to Lexington, it was much harder.
It was
Ah.
Arlington Heights.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's close to Lexington.
Right. those
Yeah.
were hard. Yeah.
I was just going to add also from my experience looking for housing then that realtors would not participate in renting or selling to Black families.
Mhm.
It was a disgrace, but they just would not do it.
Mhm.
And they would claim that if they did, they would never, no one would contact them to sell to,
Right.
sell their properties.
So that's why we had this organization.
Yes,
That
right.
we did all the front work and would meet with the realtors.
Mhm.
I'm hoping that that is still not the case in places like Arlington.
I
Mhm.
remember talking to my aunt in 1972, something like that. And she's a realtor. And she said, well, I just guide people to places where they'd be happier. I just tell them, oh, you wouldn't be happy here. You'd be much happier over there. And I was just spitting. I was so angry. But I was only, like 20 years old. What did I know? She was the one that was a professional. And so that was the end of that conversation. But yeah, it was, I remember this very distinctly.
Well, after we had helped this family get settled in Arlington, as I said, they did not stay long because the story had quickly gone around, and the neighborhood wasn't particularly accepting or welcoming. Like people in Annisquam, when a new person moves in, I'm sure somebody appears at the door and has a loaf of bread or something, and that doesn't happen always.
So I've received a request. I see Pegris has a question too, but before we do that, John and Ann, can you tell us more about your experience in Selma?
Tell us more about something.
In Selma. Okay, well, it was one day. We left early in the morning. It was a chartered flight. Elliot Richardson, who gained even more fame in Watergate, as standing up against Richard Nixon. Elliot Richardson was the Attorney General then, was the leader of our delegation. And we arrived in Selma in time for the memorial service at Brown's Chapel. And
Who was it for? The memorial?
for Reverend Reed. And the church was packed, but of course, as an official state delegation, the Massachusetts delegation was seated in the chapel, but the attendees overflowed far into the street outside the chapel. And there were a number of dignitaries who took part in that service, leaders of several religious groups, as well as civil rights leaders. But it was clear that the Martin Luther King eulogy would be the peak of the service. And an interesting bit about that. Of course, there'd already been one attempt on Martin Luther King's life, which he survived by not sneezing when a knife was close to his aorta, but that was a while before. But everybody knew that his life was in danger. And I was seated near the front of Bronze Chapel, where I had a good view of much of the balcony. And I was distressed to see one person in the balcony who was clearly very agitated and kept looking down at Martin Luther King and then looking out as if he might be looking for a chance, like John Wilkes Booth, to shoot King and escape. But he obviously was checking his watch because he had to catch a flight or something, because he left before King finished, and you could see he was very reluctant, but the whole agitation was just that he had to get out to get a flight, and could he stay for the eulogy? So I breathed a great, great sigh of relief when he left the balcony. Martin Luther King's eulogy is easily accessible if you Google it. It was rather a pastiche of a lot of speeches that he had given, but that didn't make it any the less moving. Following the service, the people in the chapel and those surrounding the chapel kind of recapitulated the march towards Montgomery, but groups dropped off of the march as they needed to. Our group had to fly back to Boston that evening, so we only got a few miles out of town. One element of that stuck with me was watching the white people along the route, and one little girl's reaction particularly struck me. And I tried to think how it looked in her eyes to see these people, archbishops of the Russian Orthodox Church and bishops of the Catholic Church in all their ecclesiastical finery, parading down the street. And you could see she was just laughing at this comical parade in a kind of sarcastic, she couldn't have been more than 9 years old or so, but she just thought this was the funniest thing she ever saw. And I realized if I had been in her position, all those niggers and all those crazy whites and all, prancing down the street, what do they think they're doing coming to my town? And I realized how absolutely both baffled and amused and maybe distressed she was at this. That 9-year-old, I sometimes wonder, how does she view things now after all these years? In any case, as we were leaving town, walking along the highway towards Montgomery, somebody came up with word from John Lewis. Now, John Lewis's skull had been fractured on Bloody Sunday. John Lewis was the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there was considerable tension between SNCC and SLIC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's organization. It was primarily generational, but tactics were part of the issue. And the concern was that from the SNCC's point of view, and this was particularly in terms of Turnaround Tuesday, when Martin Luther King had negotiated with the officials in Selma through an intermediary that they would march across the bridge to the other side, but then turn around. They would, when the state police would be there, but they would not confront the police and the police would not confront them. They would make their statement and turn around and leave. And John Lewis and the SNCC officials felt that that was betraying the cause, and that they ought to do as was done on Bloody Sunday and suffer the consequences of their righteous protest. Anyhow, the word came from John Lewis that the SNCC people were now at the Capitol in Montgomery, and mounted police were beating them, and that it was a terrible scene and that they needed help. And I was torn. I knew about the tension between the two groups. I worried that we might be being manipulated in the tug of war between the two groups. But, and there was some discussion among some of us as to whether we should jump ship from the flight back to Boston and go to Montgomery to help John Lewis. But in the end, we all flew back to Boston. A few days later, I forget the exact date now, the marches continued. Now I'm blocking on her name, Viola Liuzzo, who was ferrying protesters from the Capitol back to Selma, was shot and murdered not far from where we ended our walk along that highway to Montgomery. And of course, her death brought even more outrage, though, of course, in retrospect, I think we all realized that there had been many, many, many Blacks who had died unnoticed, unnamed by the white civil rights activists.
And then what happened with the young people that wanted, then we got the message that the young people needed to have a break.
Well, okay, that's the next chapter. Because the voting rights effort had been going on long before Selma made the news, and continued afterwards, we got word through our friends in Roxbury that the adults in Selma were concerned about the young people who had been under such strain, and said, could they get a break? Could they just have a vacation? So we helped arrange and pay for the trip. They'd go to DC for a day, see the
Had an
sights,
old rickety bus.
and then come to Roxbury and on up to Ipswich, which had a very active parallel group to our Cape Ann Council for Civil Rights.
John
And then-
Updike.
John Updike was a leader of that group, and then come to Cape Ann for a couple of days, then go back to Roxbury for the next week. And their week in Roxbury combined sightseeing, voter registration, and I think a freedom school. So it wasn't entirely a vacation, but it was certainly a change of venue. And their time on Cape Ann, I don't remember any negatives from that experience.
I think we all were afraid that they would never go home because they would have such a good time when they they spent a weekend in Ipswich, and they stayed with people who had lovely homes and estates. John Updike kept a couple of kids at his home, and he had a pool and horses, and it was just pretty plush. And then when they came over to Gloucester, they stayed in some homes in Annisquam and in Gloucester. We knew none of our homes would quite match up with where they were staying in Ipswich, but at least they would know there was a whole variety of people. And they went to Gloucester High School to see what our high school looked like here. And I don't know whether Jeffrey was a part of that, or Debbie, whether you were a part of that when they went to school. And then everybody went into Roxbury. And then they saw what it was like in the north, which was the north isn't any better than the south. And they knew then that they just might as well go back home. Here's there are some pictures.
So here's a photo, the only one that I could find
Oh, lovely.
online of the youth of Selma visiting Gloucester. And it says the Gloucester hostess Barbara Gray is at left, with left to right Georgia Wills, Roselle Brown, Sarah Bush, Emma Jean Green, Arilla McDonald, Olive Selma, and Patricia Amero and Caroline Burnham of Gloucester.
Uh-huh.
Oh, that's
Burnham-
wonderful.
Yes, that's a treasure.
Uh-huh. Well, I contacted the Gloucester Daily Times to see if there were archives online, and a staff member very kindly and very quickly responded no, but the library does have microfiche of the issues, and I'm sure there are articles there because Paul Kenyon was editor of the Gloucester Daily Times and a very active member of the Annisquam Village Church, and I'm sure he had excellent stories in the Times. So somebody could go there and look it up.
But the time that the group of young people from Annisquam and Ipswich all went into Roxbury to have the final night together. We were going to have a big party at the Blue Hills
Community Center.
And we had the Blue Hills people had arranged to have a nearby elementary school opened up for us for a gymnasium and have open space. It was a Saturday night, I think. And so 50 or 60 of us arrived at this elementary school, and the custodian said, no, I can't let you in here till Louise Day Hicks gives her permission. And we were sure we had permission, but there was no way we were going to get into that elementary school. So we had to all turn around and go back to the community center and put together our final evening in Boston, demonstrating how people were often treated in Boston. We were turned away. And the next day, then, everybody got on their bus, and the rickety old bus, we were sure it would never make it, but that was going to take them home, and nobody stayed in Gloucester. Nobody stayed in Boston after that. But then we had helped because people in Selma, we found their economic system is still, the economic level is still very, very difficult. And we had raised money to send clothing and food, the various things that they said they needed. And we worked with to continue that kind of a contact.
Well, and you, I'm not sure just when it happened, but we had a quilt sale, and the women of Selma sent many quilts up, which we sold, and we still have one we forgot to get the quilt out. But anyhow, one very cherished but very well worn Selma quilt. I see there are other hands up.
Yep, Peg and then Jim. Peg Riss.
You have to unmute.
I have a question about what was life like in the pulpit in Annisquam in the early 60s. You know, today we're blessed with Reverend Sue, who manages, I think, very powerfully, but also very tactfully to weave contemporary issues into her talks in the scriptures every Sunday. We arrived in Annisquam, Peg and I, in the mid 70s, maybe late 70s, I guess. It was a fairly conservative place. And I'm trying to imagine what you were able to talk about in the pulpit.
Yeah.
Well,
And did you ever get in
because
trouble?
Annisquam went up and down.
Yeah.
It had times in its history, you
Well-
know, how everyone in its history converted to universalism when their pastor became a universalist.
Well, I was very fortunate. My predecessors, my immediate predecessor was George Gross, a very middle of the road and Presbyterian and an excellent pastor. And he was there, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 years. And he, I think it could safely be said, saved the Annisquam Village Church from completely disintegrating. His immediate predecessor was a retired Presbyterian missionary from Korea, a very conservative person. His immediate predecessor was a very radical Unitarian, and the one before him was a Quaker Unitarian. But the church had, when the Universalists and Unitarians merged, the Annisquam Village Church stayed out, in part because of dissatisfaction with this very radical poet Unitarian. Actually, I don't think he was all that radical, but he seemed that way to the congregation. And they said, no, if that's what Unitarians are like, we're not going there. So they swung to the other end of the spectrum and went with this very conservative Presbyterian. So had it not been for George Gross, I don't think I would have survived. Fortunately, the people of Annisquam were very tolerant of this young minister. I was just in my second year of divinity school. What did I know? Not much. My advantage was that I had been raised in liberal Presbyterian churches under excellent pastors. So I think maybe despite myself, I knew something about what pastoring was about. One of the ironies is I became the director of field education at Harvard Divinity School, and the rules of that office were you don't ever do the things that I did. You don't pastor a church without much seminary training and blah blah blah. Anyhow, people tolerated me in a very generous way. I'll put
But you
it.
brought people then.
But somehow the congregation grew, and as I indicated at the beginning, they grew with the addition of people with great talent and so much dedication. Looking at those notes, Hank Junker, whose wife Judy just died. Hank was one of the representatives to the Cape Ann Council of Churches. He was advisor to one of the youth groups. He was a Sunday school teacher. Already the Junkers were key people in the congregation, and they continued to do that decade after decade after decade. And that's the kind of people who held that church together. Now, I can tell you all sorts of stories.
See,
like,
Mark wanted you to say, did you see Mark's note? He
uh,
wanted to know about the general.
okay, the General Cunningham, who taught French at West Point. And
I just have to interrupt. We live in General Cunningham's house.
Ah, yes. Okay. Well, as you know, because there's still a clock, the pastor faces the clock on the front of the balcony. And the services then began at 1/4 of the hour and ended at 1/4 of the hour. And the reason for that is that Shays Market closed at noon. And you had to get your newspaper before noon. And the general had to get from church to Shays Market before noon on Sunday, or he wouldn't have his paper. And therefore, if that young whippersnapper of a minister was speaking too long, the governor would so that the whole congregation could hear, and they knew perfectly well what was being communicated. But one of the difficulties is that the general would sometimes fall asleep during the sermon. And then I had to decide whether to modulate my voice quietly so as to allow him to finish his nap, or get louder, in which case he was likely to wake up with a start and everybody would then laugh. We also had Norm Olson, who was stone deaf, but if the word communist or communism was spoken by the pastor, Norm would stand up. I would say to the pastor as he left, if I ever hear that language in this church again, I'm not coming anymore. So we had a few characters then. I don't know about you, Reverend Sue, if you've encountered any of those in Annisquam, but they were there then.
Well, the good news for me is I can always mute them on Zoom.
Yes, Jim O'Neill has his hand up.
Jim's looking to say something.
Yeah, I think I'm one of those characters, John Elder, that you're talking about, the Reverend Sue has to deal with. But
Well, we've
I want to make
noticed
reference
that.
to. I want to make reference to your text here.
I think
the
there are
heat.
two characters in your household.
No,
Ah, yes.
not necessarily.
You said in your text he could better use the time, energy, and money the trip would take on projects right here, which is kind of good because I think your wife said this segregation was down south was visible. Up here is just as bad, but maybe less visible. But the other thing was, and secondly, for their presence to be truly meaningful, clergy ought to have the backing of their own congregations, and he had not sought the supportive vote of the Annisquam Village Church. Now, that's you, I take it. Why didn't you, was there a reason why you didn't seek the support of the church? Or you think you would get it, or?
No, it just was a matter of timing. The service came, memorial service came so quickly after his death, and I think I would have if there'd been more time to talk that through and ask the church what should I do? What would you like me to do? Given the circumstances of our nation.
The last thing was you talked about the Boston Public Schools. I think in the last week or so, I saw something that shocked me, that the graduation rate, they were kind of excited, it went from 59% to 69%. Kids that started ninth grade, only like 70% finished them. And I'm saying, what happens to those kids that don't have a high school education, and what kind of jobs do they get? You know, what's their future? We know poverty breeds violence. So things haven't changed. The more things change, the more they say the same. It's just a different type of educational apartheid, I think.
Right, right. Yep.
Thanks, Jim. Dee Dee, did
Thank
you
you.
have a question? Please unmute.
I think that we could mention.
Okay, you're,
the
Now, am I
schools
there?
in Gloucester.
yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dee Dee.
I just wanted to welcome John and Ann and say I was here when they were here, and it was a wonderful time. I also wanted to note that I taught school in Florida in 1957, and it was in a public high school, obviously segregated, in Tampa. My husband was in the service, and I had to tread very carefully because my wishes and my philosophy, I think even though I was very careful, were apparent, I guess, as being a Northerner. And in this public high school, I taught high school English, and I had students who had never even had to write a complete sentence. And one of the teachers came up to me and said, well, you know, we could not integrate. It would pull our standards down. And it was also that same year that integration was an issue in Arkansas with Kefauver. So it was a very interesting time to be teaching. And of course, it led to the 60s when things kind of blew up, and in 1965, I hadn't realized, John and Ann, that that was the same year that you had moved away and I had moved. We had moved up the line, and I had become quite involved with Metco in my suburban whatever. So I've found this very, very interesting and very nostalgic, and also with lots of issues to still be worked on, and in education and other parts of our society. So thank you for coming and doing this.
Thanks, Dee Dee.
Thank you, Ed.
Oh, well, John, I think, unfortunately, I muted you inadvertently.
There we go. Paul and Isabel Sargent were great supporters of the church and good friends, and Paul was one of my heroes. The Sargent family was one of those great families in the Annisquam Village Church community.
Hopefully still are.
Definitely still are from here.
Yeah, good. We talk about the schools in Gloucester. There was a period when, as I think John mentioned in his writing, when the schools had, the high school had a naval ROTC and junior ROTC. And there were some folks from our civil rights group who didn't appreciate having, excuse me, the military in the schools, and had tried to see if it could be eliminated. But it was important for a lot of people to have this kind of training. But then it was taken out of our hands because they appointed a lovely black man to be the one in charge of the Naval ROTC.
Naval, junior.
The junior ROTC. And this meant he was the most important person in the high school. And the biggest event of the year was when they had a big banquet and a dance. And the mothers, the girls who were in the ROTC and the mothers all had to dance with the leader. Well, that was only once. And then that summer, the ROTC quietly closed up the doors and left, and we've never had them come back, have we?
Other questions?
That was Mark.
Kathleen?
So,
Okay, you are unmuted.
oh, thank you. Hi, I'm so happy to see you both.
Likewise.
And I'm just wondering, You mentioned in your account about a couple of concerts that you had during that period.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering how involved people were at the time. I mean, like, was it strictly a musical occasion, or were you able to animate some other, participation through that?
What do you mean when when the Blue Hill
Choirs.
choir came out? I'm
Yes.
trying to, I wish Inez was on this call, but she hasn't shown up yet. Because she could talk about that from her perspective. And I have trouble conjuring up a picture of one of those concerts. And maybe you have a better recollection.
That they came out and the choir sang in the church, and then groups went in to sing with a freedom choir at Blue Hill too.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of choir, and everybody liked to sing all the what were the
The
songs?
freedom songs.
The
yeah.
freedom songs. You could all take hold of hands and stand in a circle and clap
Yeah.
and sing.
And with We Shall Overcome.
Is there still a Blue Hill Choir? I don't know about it.
I don't know. We would have to ask Inez when she lives in Roxbury.
I looked up, I Googled Blue Hill and looked at the various places that are identified, the McDonald's and so forth, and I didn't know Blue Hill Community Center popped up, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. I just don't know.
But Inez was a leader of choral groups, and she helped bring people or to organize them. And Margaret Eddy helped also. She lived in Rockport at that time and led the choir at the
No, she
Annisquam
wasn't.
Church.
Leah Knowlton was then, but Margaret was still active on the Cape.
And our other friend was
there's a hand there.
Jay.
Jay Whittier.
Perry McIntosh on this call. Perry, you lived in Alabama. I'm interested. I mean, experience in Alabama.
That's a little far.
Said I was just a child. I spoke a little bit about it at the last meeting. I don't know what you want me to say.
I remembered that Grace Murray and Grace and Dave took one of the students, and their son David was their oldest son, and he was saying when John was the oldest Murray boy, he still is. But the last time I saw him, he said, that's the first time I had an experience like that. And for many people in Gloucester High School, they hadn't had chance to have friends, interracial friends like that, and hadn't known anyone as a peer, so that it was a good experience for them to go into the freedom schools or to have kids like the kids who had come from Selma stay in their homes and go to school with them. That was a very new experience. And we had another friend who came out and talked at the church, and he and his family camped up in the Bob Natty's place up in the Lanesville. And he brought his young children, and they stayed on the Cape and felt very, very warmly welcomed. And they still talk about it. We have pictures of the young children on the rocks over at the beach at the lighthouse beach, you know, all those rocks. And we visited these people in Germany, and this young man had pictures of his family sitting on the rocks on Lighthouse Beach, and that was what his screensaver was. And it was very touching because it had meant so much to them. And that was what he saw every day, Lighthouse Beach in Annisquam.
Lindsay, you have a
Lindsay,
question or a comment?
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, it's so wonderful that you are doing this. Thank you so much. And so lovely to see you both. I wanted to ask about you during this time. How did you deal with your level of discouragement or despair during this?
You're talking about now.
Or then.
Or
Well, I
then.
was thinking about then. You can talk about now too. But that would certainly be helpful too.
You keep working at things. The issues of human society, the fundamental character of those issues doesn't change over the years, decades, and centuries, which is one of the values, I guess, of having more hours than I want to remember, engrossed in late medieval and Reformation history of Christian thought, and seeing the periods of cruelty and intolerance that both produced by institutions and corrected by institutions, and sometimes the same institution, the church, to realize how often human society has come nearly to extinguishing itself, and yet somehow has survived. So even today, I was just talking with one of my environmental heroes, David Orr, and saying I oscillate daily, maybe more often than daily, between hopefulness about the future and just despair that so we're approaching so many tipping points simultaneously in terms of climate change, but that's also true in terms of the frailty of democracy as we see around the world. And will we survive is the great question. And two of our children are on this call, and they must ask that question about their children. But there is within nature itself and within human nature that creativity, which is amazing creativity and resilience, and life persists, and somehow purpose emerges out of that and gives meaning to our lives. So I don't. The sermon I preached the Sunday after Selma dealt with this. Unfortunately, the notes are a bit sketchy, so I'm not sure what words of wisdom I thought I was communicating. But anyhow, I continue with this oscillation to end up on the hopeful side rather than the despair side. But I think anybody who doesn't have some of that oscillation must be absolutely blind to the dangers of our time.
Thank you.
But to see what happens in the Annisquam Village Church, how it grows and thrives, and you people are asking the right questions and are putting yourself into doing a lot of the good work. So there is hope. There is real hope. And there's beauty. It's beautiful to see. So we thank you.
Yeah. It's one reason I come to worship on Sunday mornings is Annisquam. It's obviously Reverend Sue's message and the music. Thank you very much. But it's also those slides with the pictures of Lighthouse Beach and just the beauties of that. Which I've painted many times.
Well, we are so grateful, John and Ann, that you can join us on Sundays, that you made time to join us tonight to offer us the writing that you offered. Can we all give them an expression of our gratitude?
And our gratitude.
Well, dear friends, I want to thank everyone for participating tonight. We will meet again next month, TBA, in terms of what we will be reading or watching in preparation. And the diversity and inclusion team that is forming will be meeting again a week from Saturday to talk about our next steps. If you are interested in our diversity and inclusion work through the church, please let me know, and we would be happy to have you participate in the formation of this important work of the church. May you all be blessed tonight with a restful sleep, and until we meet again, good night.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you both. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
John
you.
and
This
Ann.
is fantastic.
Really enjoyed hearing your stories. Thank you so much.
Good night.
See you on Sunday.
Long, Debbie
Zoom.
Campbell.
Love to.
Jeffrey Rochon. Oh, there he is. Goodbye, Jeffrey.
Goodbye,
Rochon.
Jeffrey.
Bye, Mom. Bye, Dad.
Elders, can you hear me? This is Vicki Godfrey.
It was great to see you.
Nice
Yeah,
to see you.
You're all grown up.
Where did you get that?
I'm a little more than that.
And elders, this is Vicki Godfrey, Isabel and Paul's granddaughter. And I don't know if you remember, do you remember when I came out and stayed with you when I was looking at Oberlin College?
Oh my
Do
gracious.
you remember that?
That was a while ago.
It was, well, but yes, well, I won't tell you how old, it was a very long time ago.
But you didn't come back to Oberlin to stay.
I didn't, but I remember coming and staying at your house, and it was wonderful, and you were so incredibly welcoming. So thank you so much for tonight.
Oh, thank you for showing in. So long, Deb Campbell.
Hi, Debbie.
Great to see you.
Nice
Oh,
to
it's so
see
good to
you.
see you. Yeah.
And
Hang in
Jeff
it.
Rochon, I'm glad that you're taking care of the city of Gloucester. Jeff.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Just a little bit longer.
Good night, everyone. Thank you again, John and
Thank you,
Ann.
Sue. Yeah.
Night, Sue.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Oh, wonderful to see you.
Our organs are doing well in Oberlin.
Yeah.
Here they are.
Yes.
And you do know about our granddaughter who was inspired by coming and hearing the organ at the Annisquam Village Church.
Right.
Right.
I forgot about that. Thank you for reminding me. There's the builder right here.
Right.
Yes.
That's what we thought. Okay.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks again, Sue.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.